Throughout history, religions have been shaped, challenged, and even dismantled by truth and evidence. But few belief systems face such a critical dependency on maintaining a narrative as Islam. The phrase, "without lies, Islam dies," is not a slogan born of prejudice. It's a bold statement pointing toward the religion's historical reliance on unverifiable claims, suppression of dissent, and distortion of history. In this video, we will explore why Islam's foundations cannot survive sustained exposure to truth, and how modern research, archaeology, and even early Islamic sources themselves reveal cracks in the official story. Islam's origins rely heavily on oral traditions and narratives compiled centuries after the events they claim to record. The earliest biography of Muhammad, Ibn Ishaq's Sirah, was written over 100 years after his death, and even then, large portions were admitted to be hearsay. Without this tapestry of stories, Islam loses its core foundation. What's more troubling is the historical silence. For nearly a century after Muhammad's supposed lifetime, there's a noticeable absence of contemporary Islamic records or inscriptions referencing him as a prophet. The first known coins bearing Muhammad's name appeared decades later, suggesting his story evolved with time. In the absence of direct contemporary evidence, Islam relies on carefully crafted narratives that are resistant to scrutiny. When those narratives are fact-checked through archaeology and non-Islamic historical sources, contradictions appear. And for a religion whose truth claims are presented as unquestionable divine facts, such contradictions are catastrophic. One of Islam's most repeated claims is that the Quran has been perfectly preserved, letter for letter, since the 7th century.
However, this assertion collapses when examined critically. Ancient Quranic manuscripts, such as the Sana'a palimpsest, contain significant textual variations from the modern standard version.
Muslim apologists often argue that these differences are minor, but that's misleading. Some changes affect meaning, theology, and doctrine. Early Islamic history even records that Caliph Uthman ordered the burning of other Quranic versions to enforce one official text, a clear indication that competing versions existed. Furthermore, carbon dating shows that some manuscript fragments predate the final official version, meaning the Quran was not a single, unaltered book revealed and preserved instantly, but a compilation that underwent edits and censorship. When the preservation myth falls, the claim that the Quran is a flawless, divine revelation falls with it. In societies where Islam dominates, questioning the official narrative isn't just discouraged, it can be fatal. Apostasy and blasphemy laws exist precisely to prevent individuals from exposing contradictions in doctrine or history. This fear-driven censorship protects the religion from scrutiny. The political use of Islam further enforces its insulation from criticism. Leaders and religious authorities benefit from the unquestionable status of the Quran and Hadith, as these texts justify their power and decisions. If the truth were widely accessible and freely debated, the religious and political structure built on Islam's divine authority would collapse. This fear of open debate demonstrates an uncomfortable reality. If the truth were enough to sustain Islam, censorship would be unnecessary. The reliance on legal and social coercion is itself evidence of a fragile ideology that must silence dissent to survive. Archaeological discoveries across the Middle East have revealed timelines and political events that directly contradict Islamic tradition. For example, inscriptions from the supposed early Islamic period often reference a monotheistic belief system but omit Muhammad entirely. Additionally, the location of Mecca as the cradle of Islam is historically questionable. Early maps and trade routes indicate that the supposed center of commerce, described in Islamic tradition, does not match Mecca's geographical reality. Even more startling, the Quran's descriptions of agriculture and plant life do not fit Mecca's environment, raising the possibility that the origins of Islam were elsewhere. When these discrepancies are presented, Islamic scholars often respond with theological arguments rather than historical counter-evidence. This reliance on faith over facts further supports the view that Islam cannot withstand rigorous historical analysis. In the past, strict control over information allowed Islamic authorities to maintain their narrative. but the digital age has shattered those barriers. Today, ancient manuscripts, archaeological findings, and critical scholarly works are freely accessible to anyone with an internet connection. Ex-Muslims are now sharing their stories globally, offering personal testimonies of how discovering historical truths led them to leave the faith. Online forums and YouTube channels dissect Islamic claims with evidence-based critiques that are reaching millions of viewers, many of them still living in Muslim-majority nations. This unstoppable flow of information poses the greatest existential threat Islam has ever faced. Without the ability to control what people see, hear, and read, the myths that sustain the religion are exposed. And when the lies are stripped away, what remains is a human-made ideology, not a divine truth. The Hadith, collections of sayings and actions attributed to Muhammad, form the backbone of Islamic law and tradition. Yet, even Islamic scholars admit that the vast majority of hadiths are unreliable or outright fabricated. Collections like Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim were compiled more than 2 centuries after Muhammad's death, using oral chains of transmission that were prone to corruption. Historical evidence shows that political factions within early Islam forged hadiths to support their agendas, cement their authority, or discredit rivals. This means much of Islamic practice today may be based on manufactured stories rather than genuine history. When you strip away the fabricated hadiths, vast portions of Sharia law lose their foundation. The result? A religion that claims divine legal authority but is actually based on human fabrication. The Quran repeatedly describes Mecca as a lush, agriculturally rich location, completely at odds with the barren desert it is today and has been for millennia. Archaeological evidence and ancient maps suggest that the trade center described in Islamic tradition fits Petra in modern-day Jordan far better than Mecca. Researchers like Dan Gibson have pointed to the earliest mosque Qibla directions, many of which point toward Petra rather than Mecca. If the holy city of Islam was misidentified, the entire story of its origins collapses. This location problem isn't just a minor detail. It's a fatal contradiction that challenges Islam's geographic and historical credibility. The oldest Quranic manuscripts contain differences in wording, verse order, and even missing or additional verses compared to today's standardized Hafs version. The existence of different Quranic qira'ats, readings, is openly acknowledged in Islamic scholarship, but their theological implications are downplayed. If Allah's word was meant to be perfect and unchanging, why do we find multiple competing versions? The 7 Aruf tradition in hadiths is often used to justify these differences, but it creates more problems than it solves. The fact that Uthman had to burn other versions to unify the text suggests a man-made editing process, not divine preservation. Outside of Islamic texts, there's almost no mention of Muhammad for decades after his supposed lifetime. Early Christian and Jewish sources that do reference Arabs or their religion often portray them as generic monotheists, not as followers of a distinct prophet. This historical silence suggests that Muhammad's role was later amplified to solidify a political and religious identity. If Muhammad was as influential as Islamic tradition claims, his absence in early records is unexplainable, unless, of course, the narrative evolved over time. Early Islamic tradition includes the infamous Satanic Verses incident, where Muhammad supposedly recited verses acknowledging pagan goddesses, only to later retract them, claiming Satan had deceived him. Islamic tradition is filled with miraculous stories about Muhammad, splitting the moon, water flowing from his fingers, or trees speaking to him. Yet, there is zero contemporary evidence for any of these events. Even early Islamic sources admit that many miracle stories were later additions. When these miraculous claims are stripped away, Muhammad appears less as a divine messenger and more as a political and military leader. Islamic tradition is filled with miraculous stories about Muhammad, splitting the moon, water flowing from his fingers, or trees speaking to him. Yet there is zero contemporary evidence for any of these events. Even early Islamic sources admit that many miracle stories were later additions. When these miraculous claims are stripped away, Muhammad appears less as a divine messenger and more as a political and military leader. Fear of eternal hellfire is one of Islam's most powerful tools for keeping believers obedient. The Quran repeatedly threatens non-believers with gruesome punishments, ensuring that questioning the religion feels like risking eternal torture.
This fear-based control mechanism is common in authoritarian belief systems and is a hallmark of man-made religions, not divine truths. The annual pilgrimage to Mecca is portrayed as a spiritual journey, but historically, it's also a political and economic tool. By mandating this mass gathering, rulers reinforced Mecca's status as the unquestionable religious center and maintained control over the faithful.
This centralization of worship ensured loyalty to the ruling elite, blending faith and politics into a single control system. The Quran is said to be untranslatable in its true form, meaning that only Arabic-speaking scholars can interpret it fully. This creates a power imbalance, allowing religious leaders to maintain control over non-Arabic speakers by claiming special authority over the text. If a divine message is meant for all humanity, it should be equally accessible in all languages. Yet Islam deliberately limits this accessibility. From embryology claims to the shape of the earth, the Quran contains statements that contradict modern scientific understanding. Apologists attempt to reinterpret verses to fit modern science, but this is retrofitting, not evidence of divine knowledge. If the Quran truly came from an all-knowing deity, it should align with reality without reinterpretation. In the age of the internet, more Muslims are leaving the faith than ever before. Many cite historical research, exposure to other worldviews, and contradictions in Islamic texts as the reason. This growing movement is proof that when the truth is accessible, the lies that sustain Islam begin to crumble. The doctrine of abrogation, where later verses replace earlier ones, admits that the Quran is not a consistent eternal message. It reflects political adaptability rather than divine perfection. This adaptability reveals that the text evolved to suit changing circumstances, a hallmark of human authorship. Every empire, ideology, or religion built on falsehood eventually collapses when faced with undeniable truth. Islam is no exception. The tools of censorship, fear, and manipulation are losing their power in an age of information. When lies fall away, what remains is reality, and reality needs no defense. Between Muhammad's reported death in 632 CE and the earliest complete Quranic manuscripts, there exists a historical void, often referred to as the lost years. Very few verifiable events from this period are documented outside of Islamic sources, which raises questions about what was deliberately omitted or rewritten. This gap allowed early rulers to consolidate power and rewrite religious history to fit their political objectives. The lack of independent verification makes it impossible to confirm Islam's early story, leaving much of it as a post-fact creation. Many narratives in the Quran, such as the story of Noah, Moses, and Jesus, mirror earlier Jewish, Christian, and even pagan traditions. These parallels often include identical plot points and imagery, suggesting that the Quran adapted existing religious tales rather than presenting new revelations. This recycling of mythology points to a human author, or authors, familiar with the religious landscape of the time, rather than a unique divine source. Sharia law is often described as divinely perfect, yet it varies widely between Muslim-majority countries. Laws on inheritance, marriage, apostasy, and criminal punishment differ significantly depending on which hadiths or schools of jurisprudence are followed. If these laws truly originated from a perfect God, such inconsistency would not exist. The reality is that Sharia has evolved through human interpretation, proving its man-made nature. Sharia law is often described as divinely perfect, yet it varies widely between Muslim-majority countries. Laws on inheritance, marriage, apostasy, and criminal punishment differ significantly depending on which hadiths or schools of jurisprudence are followed. If these laws truly originated from a perfect God, such inconsistency would not exist. The reality is that Sharia has evolved through human interpretation, proving its man-made nature.
Islamic history is often romanticized as a period of religious coexistence and intellectual flourishing. While there were moments of tolerance, these were exceptions, not the rule. Non-Muslims were subjected to special taxes, jizya, restrictions on worship, and systemic discrimination. The portrayal of Islamic rule as universally benevolent is a modern narrative designed to shield the religion from historical criticism. The Quran and Hadith prescribe moral laws that are applied selectively. Commands for justice and compassion are often disregarded when dealing with non-Muslims or apostates. This selective morality reveals a tribal us versus them mentality that undermines claims of universal ethics. While Islam claims to be a religion of peace, its early expansion was driven largely by military conquest. Historical records confirm that within a century of Muhammad's death, Islamic armies had conquered vast territories from Spain to India. This rapid expansion was not achieved through peaceful preaching, but through political domination and the imposition of Islamic rule. As Islam spread, it often erased the cultural and religious heritage of conquered peoples. Temples were destroyed, libraries burned, and historical records replaced with Islamic narratives. This destruction ensured that alternative histories and competing belief systems were buried. Many modern Muslim apologists claim the Quran contains advanced scientific knowledge unknown at the time of its writing. Yet these miracles rely on vague verses retroactively interpreted to fit modern science. In reality, these so-called miracles are examples of confirmation bias, where believers read modern knowledge into ambiguous ancient texts. While jihad is often defended as a spiritual struggle, its historical application has overwhelmingly been military and political. Leaders used jihad to justify invasions, suppress uprisings, and rally their followers under the banner of religious duty. This exploitation of faith for political gain further undermines claims of divine purity in Islam's origins. Islam has survived for centuries by adapting its interpretation to fit new contexts. Whether softening laws in Western countries or hardening them under extremist rule, these shifts show that Islam's practice is shaped by human needs, not immutable divine will. Reform-minded Muslims who call for reinterpretation of scripture often face harsh backlash, including death threats. This resistance to change is rooted in the fear that even minor reforms will expose deeper contradictions within the religion. The portrayal of Muhammad as the perfect moral example is a carefully constructed image. Early sources depict him as a war leader, political strategist, and, at times, ruthless opponent. By omitting these details, Islamic tradition maintains a sanitized figure immune to criticism. Islam demands belief without tangible proof, framing doubt as a moral failing. This discourages rational inquiry and keeps believers dependent on faith rather than evidence. When belief is prioritized over proof, truth becomes secondary to maintaining loyalty. While Islam is often defended as elevating women's status, historical and modern realities show deep gender inequality. Inheritance laws, testimony rules, and dress codes reflect patriarchal control rather than divine justice.